Well, thanks for joining us here on this web exclusive. I'm joined by Eyewitness News Analyst Lt. General Reginald Centracchio. And first, it's a sad story we got to talk about here, but an AirAsia flight goes down over the weekend. The U.S. offered help, but initially they didn't ask for it. How come?
Usually every country and any aviation organization has its own resources initially. Once they get to a point where they've exceeded several hours, perhaps, or in this case several days, they do ask for outside help, and that's where the United States, as well as other countries, came in. And I think that's exactly what the normal scenario would be.
And so now that the U.S. is involved, what kind of aid do they provide?
Well, unfortunately, at this point, we've gone from a rescue mission to a recovery mission. So the United States is involved in actually trying to locate the debris, perhaps recovering some bodies, and helping those agencies recover as much as they possibly can as a matter of giving closure to those families.
All right, switching gears now. TSA finding more knives, guns, and other weapons. I guess it's good for the TSA that they're finding it, but what does this mean?
Kelly, you know, that's an interesting point. And the thing is that since 2007, there's been a tremendous increase in the number of weapons that they've found, knives, guns, and other contraband. I'm not sure that that's a good sign or a bad sign. Certainly from one point of view, it's a bad sign, but the other side of that coin is they're finding them. So I'm not sure whether it's because people have become more emboldened, or maybe our technology has gotten better, that maybe they were getting there before, we didn't catch them, now we are. So I guess it's a good story.
Yeah, and especially too with you know, so much information being put out there, notifying people before they get to the airport, knowing what they can and cannot take on that plane. TSA is still finding those weapons there.
Yeah.
And switching gears now to now that we have this new relationship with Cuba, what does this mean for our base in Guantanamo Bay?
You know, I'm surprised that has not come up in any kind of conversation yet, but I can guarantee you at some point in the future, as has been the case over the last 50 years or so, they've wanted us out of Guantanamo. We've paid rent there for several years, especially since Castro took over. They haven't cashed those checks in all those years because their idea is they want us out of Cuba totally. Now that that's changed to some extent, I'm not sure whether that would still be on the table or not. But the rest of the story is at some point, too, I think we'll be looking at a request to improve the infrastructure in Havana itself, because their point is that they want tourism to come in. Our point is we want to establish good relationships, perhaps, and somewhere along the line it's going to mean money for the United States. And those are the several things that need to be weighed rather heavily.
All right, and also here we are at the end of the year. We all know President Obama promised pulling troops out of Afghanistan by the end of this year, so technically that should have happened, but has it really?
You're right. 2 days ago was the end of the war. A technical end of the war. They put up the flag, pulled on the U.S. flag, and so on and so forth. And the conclusion of the responsibility for Afghanistan went to the Afghan security forces. But that does not mean that the U.S. troops and coalition forces are out of Afghanistan. And as we see, Kelly, we're still experiencing the same thing in Iraq, and that's well over a year ago. So we'll still see U.S. troops and coalition troops on the ground, no combat, but we'll still see the air war against ISIS for several years to come, I'm afraid.
And you mentioned ISIS. I mean, what does that mean with us eventually pulling, you know, our troops out of there? What does this mean for the U.S.?
It's going to mean a huge challenge for security forces, not only in Iraq, but the entire Mideast and specifically Afghanistan. I'm not sure that they have the wherewithal or the capability at this point to be able to throw back the ISIS threat as they've taken more and more territory over the last year. That will perhaps continue more. We'll see more violence. We'll see more unfortunate situations for the people of Afghanistan. And I'm not sure at this particular juncture whether the Afghan forces are able to withstand that without having U.S. troops there with them.
And just quickly, too, I know we have this deadline, pulling the troops out, but do you foresee perhaps troops going back in with ISIS still being a huge threat?
Well, if I take the example of Iraq, the answer is yes. We're doing that right now with Iraq. We said we wouldn't put troops back in, but over the last several months we've seen troops go back in, to include ground troops becoming engaged with ISIS now in some parts of of that area. But the air war cannot be won by itself. You need ground troops. What we're doing is unfortunately relying on other countries to provide those ground troops, which is not a good scenario.
All right, so an ongoing situation there, that's for sure. All right, General, thank you so much, and thanks for joining us on this web exclusive.